history. Don't know much biology. Don't know much about a science book. Don't know much about the French I took. But I do know that I love you. And I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world this would be. Don't know much about geography. Don't know much trigonometry. Don't know much about algebra. Don't know what a sliding rule is for. But I do know 1 and 1 is 2. And if this one could be with you, what a wonderful world this would be. Now, I don't claim to be an A student, but I'm trying to be. For maybe by being an A student, baby, I can win your love for me. Don't know much about history. Don't know much biology. Don't know much about a science book. Don't know much about the French I took. But I do know that I love you. And I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world this would be. La ta 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 ta. History. Biology. Well, la ta 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 ta. French I took. Yeah, but I do know that I love you. And I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world this would be.
Welcome,
Drinking
everyone.
warm water before bed balances blood sugar level.
Interrupted by an ad. That doesn't say 2024. I don't know what. So welcome, everyone, to Science on Tap, where we bring curiosity together with the community and have great conversations. I appreciate everyone coming out tonight to join us. Big thank you to our partners, Radio Artifact and Urban Artifact. It's always a great collaboration. And yeah, I believe in short intros to get right to the topic, so I'm going to hand it over to Ramy.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Ramy Amin. I'm a PhD student at the philosophy department at the University of Cincinnati. And yeah, the song that we just listened to was just don't know much about history, right? Don't know much about biology. So, and we're going to be talking about knowledge, so I thought that was an adequate thing to start with. And the question that I'm starting to pose today is, does knowledge make us better people? Like, how do we start to unpack this? And I'm just sort of going to give you the short answer, which is not really, and then the long answer, which is just says it's complicated. And this is what we're going to try to see how that goes. But let me first start by picking your brains. What is knowledge? When I say the word knowledge to you, what comes to mind? Justified beliefs. Facts. Uh-huh. What else when we think about knowledge? Epistemology. Yeah, that's a very, good.
Knowledge versus wisdom.
What's the difference?
Well, I just think of the adage I heard a while ago that knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is knowing not to put the tomato in its mouth.
That is a very wise thing to not do, but yeah. All right, so everybody has this idea about what knowledge is that's just comes to mind, and it sort of surrounds things that we take for granted about the world around us. Like professionals, medical professionals, engineers, people who know their stuff, and that's sort of what I'm trying to probe today. What are the limits of the things that we can know? What can they teach us, and what can they not teach us? Are there things that we can go out in the world and just find out about it, and other things that we just need to think about, or is all the knowledge out there in the world? These are the questions that I want to try to ask to then get from there to the question of making us better people. What do we mean by that? So first we're going to start by probing knowledge, and then we're going to start to transition towards the idea of being better people. And the sort of the case study that I'm going to focus on is medicalization. And medicalization is interesting because at a certain point it takes one phenomena that is that has existed for some time, and it sort of tries to give it a little bit more of a serious investigation to sort of figure out what the causes are and like how does it actually work. And the paper that I'm sort of focusing on is by Alison Reichelt from 2010, I believe. And in that paper, she made an interesting claim. She said, I argue that medicalization can both reinforce and disrupt existing social hierarchies within the clinic and outside of it to ill or good effect. And she gave a definition of medicalization that says it's the process by which a mental or physical condition comes to be seen as a medical condition deserving of medical attention. So you have a phenomena, mental or physical, and then it comes to be seen as a medical thing that we need to investigate, and we have some idea about how to go about investigating it. One of the sort of examples that she works with is ASD, autism spectrum disorder. And the way that she shows how medicalization operates on ASD is by showing how it used to be perceived as it's the role of the mother, which led psychoanalysis to speculate that the cause of ASD is due to having abnormal or failed relationships with their parents, especially the mother. And this was like putting all the blame on the mother for children with ASD. And then with modern medicalization, we understood that this is not the case. There's a lot of different factors that we need to take into account. And what Reichelt is trying to push us to notice is that this was accompanied by a corresponding increase in medical study and a social familiarity with the condition. So it's not just that we're learning about ASD from a medical standpoint, but we're also learning how to deal with it socially. Which led to changes such as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA Act, and a general shift in the public's perspective of ASD. But the interesting thing is that Reichelt here is sort of mushing together two distinct things. The first one is the production of the explanatory account. Like, what is ASD? Like, just looking out there in the world, how does it happen? What are the symptoms? What is the etiology? What are the treatment? And then the normative demand that is made by that explanatory account. Like, once we know what ASD is, how does that affect out the way that we navigate the world? And she's sort of saying that once we get to know more about that phenomena, once we medicalize that phenomena, that also is accompanied by that extra step, which is the normative demand. Like, let's be good people. Let's change the ways that we approach the phenomena and approach the situation. Let's be better. And the claim, as she puts it, is that in societies where the medical profession has sufficient authority, that medicalization can be a powerful source for social control or reinforcement of unjust social structure. The medical profession also may have the social authority and justification necessary to reverse marginalization. And that's where the two come together. Like, once you have that authority to start taking something seriously, you then also have the authority to sort of tell people how to navigate the social space from it. And so what we are left with is two invitations for social uptake. The first one is the epistemic uptake, which is, do you believe the medical account that is being produced by the medical institution? And then we have another one, which is the normative uptake, which is, do you then follow the recommendations by that medical institutions? And the claim seems to be that one of them follows the other. Once we know more, once we have more epistemic uptake, because we have a medical institution that sort of has that power in that society, we then have normative uptake that follows. People also start listening to it. And we shouldn't really expect something like having more epistemic uptake than normative uptake, because then we would be saying that the medical institution has the authority in the society to sort of produce knowledge of ASD, but people are not really listening to it. And at the same time, it wouldn't make sense to have epistemic uptake, we have normative uptake without epistemic uptake, because where would be the source of that normative uptake if it's tied up to some epistemic uptake? That's at least some of the implication that we can draw very tentatively from the idea of what the idea of medicalization is, and tying it to demarginalization and the idea of a normative demand that accompanies the epistemic demand. And that would be a very interesting story to have, right? Like, just have more knowledge, then you would have more normative uptake. But then that's where I started to ask questions. Like, the question is, does that really follow? Do we have this very neat picture all the time? And you can probably guess that we kind of don't, but we'll see. So one big problem in the study of ASD is that studies across the globe are haven't really been standardized. There's a lot of cultural differences. There's a lot of different ideas about the etiology, the treatments, how people view members of the ASD community, and there's a bunch of translation that has to happen before people can compare notes from studies in different cultural settings. So a lot of studies happen in the United States. ASD is one of the most studied phenomena in that space, and it's really difficult to sort of compare those results to, let's say, results that are coming from China, coming out of Lebanon, coming out of Iran, coming out of, it's not the same cultural setting that would allow you to translate that very easily. And this is why some researchers sort of tried to find a solution to that. And their solution was the Ask You Autism, Stigma, and Knowledge questionnaire. They sort of tried to introduce a standardized ASD research project that sort of mitigate these cultural differences. So let's just standardize the things that we're looking for in an ASD study, and let's make that across the board so we can easily translate and compare results from different social and cultural background. And that has been really interesting. So sample some of the questions that they are trying to use in their study is some of them are measuring knowledge, such as diagnosis and symptoms. All children with autism usually have problems with aggression. It's trying to see, like, do you know that? Do you not know? What do you think about this? Autism is a result of a curse or evil eye or put upon or inflicted on the family. Etiology, like, where does it come from? Most children with autism are extremely impaired and cannot live independently as adults. Treatment also trying to see, like, what kind of beliefs people have about members with ASD, what kind of ideas they have about it. And also, the other thing that they were trying to get at is the stigma. How much stigma is there? So some of the questions were like, autism holds a social stigma in some communities. What do you think about this? In some communities, people would feel ashamed if someone in their family was showing symptoms of autism, or there is a negative opinion towards children diagnosed with autism in some communities. So again, they were trying to measure how much stigma is there towards members, people with ASD. And right off the bat, you can see that there's an interesting thing here. They're not just studying knowledge. They're not just trying to see how much knowledge people have, but they're trying to actually see how much stigma, how much normative uptake corresponds to how much knowledge people have. And that was the interesting thing that I was looking at. Because if we're saying that medicalization comes with this idea that it also encourages people to act in a certain way, then we need to try to measure, does that actually happen? Does that actually follow? And it's not just important to know how much people know about a subject. It's also important to know how much they care about it enough to change the ways that they act. So in one of the early implementations of the study, in a state fair with 478 participants, they had some of the best results. As you can see, diagnosis is 95%, etiology 94%, treatment is 98%. brilliant numbers, and stigma 98%. And this is a good thing. The higher number is, it means that you don't hold stigma. Like, that's a good thing. So you would expect the numbers to be high across the board. If what we're saying is that knowledge tracks normativity, or normativity tracks knowledge in a certain way. And that was a really good study right out of the bat in 2018. Another study in 2017 looked at 313 students, and as you can see, the diagnosis was 72%, etiology 55%, a little on the low side, treatment 56%, but stigma was at 69%. So it sort of tracked some of the higher ends of the knowledge metrics. This means that even though participants' knowledge was barely adequate in two or three knowledge domains across the board, participants exhibited low levels of stigmatization towards ASD. And that's when we get the first NEAT model. We can see that there is some the normative uptake sort of tracks the epistemic uptake. Once people know more, then there is the stigma that they have towards ASD becomes less. But then things start to get a little bit messy. So in 2019, they ran the same study. Remember, this is the same questionnaire that is being administered all the time. We're trying to make sure that we standardize it, so this is what we're giving students or participants at any given study. The first time the test retest situation in time one, they had a number of students at 110. They scored 57% on diagnosis, 49% on etiology, 52% on treatment, but only 2.7% on stigma. And that's bad, because what that shows is that student, even though they have what would be considered some adequate knowledge of ASD, they scored very low on the stigma. And the interesting thing is that they ran the same test 2 weeks apart, because the idea was that 2 weeks is enough for students to sort of like forget about like the exact questions that they were asked. And what they found is that when they redid the test, the numbers for the knowledge are sort of the same, like 57, 49 got bumped to 50, 52 is the same. The only number that changed is the stigma. It went from 2.7 to 16.3. That's a sort of an uptick in the stigma that is associated with ASD. And the interesting part is that this was just this just happened in 2 weeks, just by showing the students the question and like putting this under some light. And then 2 weeks later, after they supposedly forgot most of the exact questions that they have received, they still registered a little bit of an uptick in the stigma. Still bad, but there is something there. Please.
They can kind of put ideas into people's heads, like made them think about it so that they could maybe recognize it more
So,
in society or around them?
that is possible. I'm not sure exactly, like, because there was no control for this, so we can't really tell what the exact reason for it is. But that's why I'm saying, like, it's just interesting that one of the things that happened, like, after 2 weeks is that there is an uptake. We still need to know what that was, but that's a different research question. But yes, that's a good question to ask. So now we have the first break between the epistemic and normative uptake. We have students with adequate numbers registering in how much they know about ASD, but the normativity doesn't track. They know a lot about it, and they can answer a lot of questions about it correctly, but the normative uptake just does not track it. And in 2021, the same study was administered to teachers in Laos, and their scores were a little rough. So 39% in diagnosis, 10% in etiology, and 14% in treatment. And this was on 154 teachers in Laos. But the interesting thing is that 40% of the teachers register that they do not have stigma towards ASD. So even with these low numbers, such as 10% etiology, 14% treatment, they still had 40%, which is like the highest number. It's as high as their knowledge of diagnosis, that they don't have stigma towards ASD. And that is interesting because that is again another break. Why do we have normative uptake when we don't have epistemic uptake? They don't know much about ASD enough to have that like change in heart and change in the way that they approach ASD. So not only do we have one break, we have two breaks. We have a break between the epistemic and the normative, and we have a break between the normative and epistemic. And it seems that under certain conditions, the two really don't track, or at least there is some other factors that might be in play that could justify that difference between the epistemic and the normative and epistemic. And this is where the thesis that I'm sort of working with comes along, is that it's not just that we have some epistemic uptake and that's all we need. It's not that we just have medicalization, that's all we need. It's a medicalization plus other factors that then gives you the normative uptake. And that's interesting because it means that we need to look at how much we get out of medicalization in a very, in a critical way, to know that we're getting a lot from it, but we know that it's not the be-all and end-all. In order for us to change the way that people think about a phenomenon, we need to engage them in other factors as well. It's not just enough to give people a list of premises that they need to memorize. And these other factors might be a lot, maybe anything. It might be religious education, it might be secular moral education, might be sports, might be community engagement, literature. In the research that I looked at, the researchers don't really sort of pin one of them as like the more important factor, but they do sort of gesture towards something like a more communal society rather than a more individualistic society that could explain the difference in the data, or something like religious education being important for that region. But there are many other factors that we can get at, and this is where the extra factors come in. And one of the ways that I try to think about the difference between just taking the epistemic side of things and just going with it as the thing that is going to give us the most buck for our money versus epistemology, like the epistemic account plus something else. I started to think about the difference between STEAM and STEM. STEM is just the science, technology, engineering, and math, and STEAM is you add the A, which is reference to the arts. And there's a lot of conversations in the educational circles that sort of tries to look at how can we optimize our teaching to get the most out of it. Can we just go all in on STEM and just like that's the thing that we're trying to look at and that's what's going to produce what we need and going to give us the future citizens that we want, or do we need something else? Do we need this the arts to be involved? And you can see how the emphasis is sort of more on the side of STEM. So for instance, there are papers that are looking at STEM education to fulfill the 21st century demand, a literature review. And another editorial piece was looking at the future of STEM education, multiple perspectives from researchers. And something like, why is STEM important? The impact of STEM education on society. And there's this narrative that is trying to say, look, if you just need to focus on STEM, and that's all you need. But that's what I'm trying to challenge. That's what I'm trying to ask the question, is that all? If I just sit in the classroom and teach people about all the quadratic equations or all the differential equations that I can, is that what we're looking for? And I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what are we trying to get at? What are we trying to produce? Like here, the question is, where is it? Yeah, fulfill the 21st century demand. What is that demand? Because are we trying to produce workers, or are we trying to produce citizens? Are we trying to produce people who can live together in a society that can care for one another, or are we trying to produce really, 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 really good mathematicians, or really, 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 really good biologists that can just like look at a cell and like tell you what that cell is? Is that what is the demand that we're trying to look at? What are we trying to get?
I would argue STEM is amoral, not good or bad.
You would say that it's amoral.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's just math is just math.
Right.
It's how you use it that matters.
Exactly. So, but it doesn't really tell you itself. Exactly. Right.
Okay, so we're all really good at math. What is that getting us? If you want a society you can grow food, people all good at math. I think you need everybody. Got to kind of got to work in harmony.
Perfect. Perfect. Exactly. You wanted to?
Yeah. So really, it was talked about the brain. The differences between STEM and STEAM.
Yeah.
Different parts of the brain.
Yeah.
And if the brain's like a muscle, if you don't exercise it equally,
Mhm.
one side more favors than the other, then if that's the case, does that in fact influence how that person treats other people or sees other people?
Yeah.
So I think personality development, that's the question I would ask in order to find out what the demand should be, is what does 75% STEM and arts 25% produce versus 50/50 or 25/25?
Exactly. Exactly. And these are the questions that we're gonna ask. Like you mentioned, harmony. Like, how do we reach that harmony? How do we reach that nice balance between these two parts of the brain, as you put it?
Well, I'm a big fan of literature because,
Me too.
yeah, and I actually saw you kind of divided up literature and religious studies.
Yeah.
But really, when you go get a religious studies, what do you study? The literature of the religion.
Yeah.
So it's kind of one and the same. And there's a theory out there that in today's age, as hard as it might seem, we're actually less violent.
Hmm.
Human beings, generally speaking, very generally speaking, we're
Yeah.
actually less violent. And one of the theories behind that is we are more exposed to more books, more TV, more movies,
Yeah.
all this literature that's teaching us these morals and ethics of how to behave.
Yeah.
So I've always found that.
I think part of it is what you're trying to build is empathy, right? So perspective
Yeah.
taking is something that literature says happens quite a lot when you just read books.
Oh yeah.
Perspective taking. And this is something that you don't normally, I mean, you can read like a history of science book and
Hmm.
maybe imagine your Einstein from it.
Yeah.
I think literature definitely puts you in the shoes of people you would never imagine being.
Actually, two of my friends were working on a project that was trying to say that literature is one of the best avenues to teach children and young adults about like the world in a more like in a safer environment, to like expose them to like different social complex situations and sort of like show them how to work through these situations, like in a sort of like running a simulation basically, but with a lot of the complexities that we have in our society.
See what goes wrong when you make like anti-social decisions too.
Exactly. Exactly.
Wasn't that one of the cartoons from when we were kids? You know, there's always a moral at the end that they like to teach. They don't really have that in cartoons anymore.
It is a different shape. It took a different shape. It's more like entertainment and like just pretty songs and some
Shiny pictures.
Exactly. But maybe it's more about like just capturing attention than the message that is being or something like that. But yeah, like you mentioned and you also elaborated, there is sort of this role that movies and stories that help in shaping our personalities and like how do we connect with other people in our society. And that I think is very important because two interesting results or observations that I found during my research is that we hear a lot, like in person, I would say, like just conversationally, some arguments against STEAM, but I really struggle to find like an actual like just here's why we shouldn't have STEAM. There's a lot of literature about like why we should have STEAM, what the benefits are, but then you get surprised because in conversations you still have this undertone of like, why are we doing this? Why are we giving the arts space? And it's interesting because I would love for the people that are trying to make that argument to put it in print so we can actually respond. Like, what are the premises and can I run through the logic to like actually see what the argument is? But there is sort of a lack of like a concrete arguments, and maybe I'm missing something in the literature, but it would be interesting to find that out. And the other interesting thing is that there's actually relatively little empirical data testing the effectiveness of moral education strategies, which you would expect like from so much talk about like how STEAM is very important and how we need the arts and moral education to be part of our educational system, that there would be more empirical data that's trying to actually test this effectiveness. But the failure is on both sides. It's on the side of the people that are trying to say STEAM, we just need to get rid of that, we just need to focus on STEM, and also on the side of the people who are trying to say that STEAM is important because they're not really providing a lot of empirical data that shows the effectiveness of the strategies that are employed. And the review that I looked at was from 2008, and it looked at, I think, 75 different papers that were testing different aspects of the moral education strategies, and some of them were looking at class participation, some of them were looking at the discussion groups, some of them were looking, but there's nothing standardized. Remember when I mentioned the problem of standardization at ASD and how ASCII is trying to like combat that? We still don't have something like that for moral education strategies so that we can say, here's an effective method that can actually change people's perspective. Here's something that we need to tweak to sort of like get some more mileage out of it. Because at the end of the day, you have like, 10 to 20 weeks in any given semester. That's all the time you have to sort of like build that change in perspective, and you need to have a return on investment at the end. But if we don't have sort of like accurate descriptions, accurate empirical data that can tell us how to track this, then we're still left in the dark in a certain way. But there is some hope for some indications that this actually does work in certain area. So for instance, day 2002, putting yourself in other people's shoes, there was a study that was conducted. The aim was increase students' empathy with refugees and homeless people. The participation, 3 ethnically diverse schools in London, and the number of participants were 20, age 11 to 15. And the study method was interviews before and after the workshop. So they would interview them before the workshop, they would take the workshop, then an interview right after, and then another interview 2 months later. And immediately after, they noticed that the workshop evoked enthusiasm for action. So there is like this uptake that happens after the workshop for people to sort of like try to change something about the perception of refugees and homeless people around London. But the interesting thing is that 2 months later, the initial enthusiasm had been replaced by frustration, mainly because students had no idea how to take further action. And that's what stayed. Like, how could, like, we now have all this knowledge about like how to change things. Like, what do we need to do to sort of like combat sort of the false image of refugees and homeless? But what can we do? But then the question, like, the researchers like pointed at this as like a sort of like a puzzling effect. But then I would ask myself, what would I rather leave the students with? Would I rather leave the students knowing that there is a false perception of refugees and homeless people in London that needs to be changed, and sort of hope that down the line somebody would be in a position to do something about it? Or would I rather just not even have that conversation happen? I think I would rather have the first. I would rather have the possibility that maybe something would change. Maybe they can't change for something right now, and they're left with a sense of frustration. But that's maybe down the line something that's going to lead to some change. Some policy, somebody would end up in a situation where they can actually do something about it.
Quick question. So are you trying to standardize like moral behavior or moral
it's not standardized the exact morals that we're teaching our students, but it is trying to see what strategies we can implement to just teach whichever part of morality that we need to emphasize. So let's say that you're a teacher and you want to try to have more emphasis on perspective taking. What would be the most effective thing for you to employ in your classroom? Is it something like discussions? So more discussions, more debate oriented?
Well, are you going by the basis that morality is relative, or are you going more by Kant's categorical imperative?
That is a good question. I don't have an answer to that because what I'm looking at is just the methodology. Like, what can we? Content-wise, that would be a different debate. Like, what things should we teach our students? That's a different debate. But what I'm looking at is the effectiveness of the method, regardless of what content you want to teach. I would hope that the content is good, but what I'm looking at is what is the effective thing to do for the thing that you're trying to communicate to the students.
What I would imagine is that 2 months later, the people were separated from not only the memory of the workshop, the other people that were attracted, they weren't getting that positive reinforcement to continue a behavior, because that's what we need as humans. We need to reinforce behavior to keep doing it. If we see negative, if we see something to stop something,
Yeah.
it'll slow down the progress and eventually the behavior will stop.
Yeah. That's interesting. So like it's sort of like a train that is going, but like it keeps stopping, like because there's nothing that it just keeps pushing it. And
When did
it
you start this? You started at like second, third grade so that they have a better idea, or are you talking to college age kids? Because
That's-
it's a different perspective.
these are one of the things that I'm asking. Like, how do we know which sort of approach fits which which perspective or skill, moral skill that we need to teach at what age? That's a whole different like research project right there. But that's what I'm trying to like point towards. Like there's a lot of work that needs to be done there to sort of start having a conversation about standardizing this so that we can know across the board, like we can compare notes across the board. Because without having some sort of a standard, we're trying to adjust for way too much. As ethnically diverse schools in London are not the same thing as schools in Egypt. It's not the same thing as schools in Nicaragua. It's just a completely different story. And if you're trying to do the translational work, first you need to like be an expert in both of them, and then you need to like understand what are the relevant components. It's just a mess. That would be a mess. You do lose things by standardization. I'm not saying that this is like the be all and end all, but it's about how much can you get for the standardization that you implement and the things that you lose with standardization. That's also like a question about, again, the methodology and not.
Also think hermeneutics too, philosophy of interpretation.
Exactly. What things are going to be left out, what things are going to be relevant. That's a whole can of worms. And one way to sort of like push that aside is how much can we put into a standardized sort of questionnaire or something that we can look at to sort of glean into things that really work at a certain age for a certain skill at a certain social situation. And another study that was conducted by Schultz, Bott and Selman in 2011, the value of developmental approach to evolving character development programs. So the aim was to foster human and responsible citizenship, was particularized in teaching students specific skills, critical thinking skills and perspective taking. And that took place in a classroom in a 10-week or semester program called the Facing History and Ourselves. And the study was a quasi-experimental study with a pre-test and post-test design. The number of students were 346, 22 classes, ages around 14 years old. The results were that they found students scored significantly higher on interpersonal development in general. There was a decrease in racism compared to a control group that they were studying. But then the things that I'm talking about, like what things work at what exact context, is like there was no change in perspective taking, although perspective taking was one of the core aims of the study. And there was no change in moral development compared to control. So two of the things that they were looking at did not change. There was a huge increase in interpersonal development and some decrease in racist tendencies. But that's why the conversation around these issues are still is still very much alive, because whatever ends up being the factor that will give us the most out of the investment that we put into it, it's not going to happen it's not just going to be a straightforward answer. It's not going to just be, oh, religion is going to be the answer. No, secular moral education is going to be the answer. Just literature and you're going to be fine. There's a ton of factors that need to be put into these conversations to sort of figure out the most optimal strategy that you can implement to get the most mileage out of that strategy. In that context, considering the social and cultural space that you're trying to implement today. And that's it. That's all I have for you today. Thank you. So, discussion, questions. Let's talk.
14-year-olds have a perspective this big. I have a niece who's 14. I was telling her she's going to go to high school and it's talking about how uncomfortable it is because it's somewhere new. And it's like, your perspective's this big. Like, life is so long. This is nothing.
Yeah.
So I feel like changing a 14-year-old perspective, you did frame the ages. Like that would have been.
Totally fair.
Been a better argument.
But then imagine if we're talking about changing the perspective taking abilities of an 11-year-old or a 10-year-old. Then some questions that we need to ask is how do we break down this skill to more fundamental skills that if they take up at a certain age, then we know that it's going to have to develop in a certain way later on. And it's kind of putting it this way is a little bit of it's more of a mechanistic look at it. How can we break this big thing into little things and then teach the children these 1, 2, 3 at this age so that we can. But at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to get. You're trying to systematize some way to sort of not ensure, but have the highest chance possible to teach the students, the children, that skill at a certain age, to have the best possible chance at becoming citizens and not just becoming workers. But that's not what you want. You don't want a society that is just full of really good workers who are really good at capitalism. That's not really the thing. But you need workers that do their work, but you also need citizens that can live together, that can talk to one another. Part of the political divide is just rooted in this idea that we can't talk to one another. But how do you mitigate that? You don't mitigate it by just giving people until they're 25 or 30 years old, and now you start talking to one another. No, you start from scratch. You start from really young age to build these values in.
One thing I've learned is you can read 10,000 stories, 10,000 books, whatever. Sometimes you only learn a moral lesson when you accidentally committed an immoral act, and then you realize why it was wrong.
Yeah. Sometimes that is. Although I would hope that we don't reach that position, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes you can have every story in the world, but sometimes you don't learn why something is immoral until you've committed that act.
Yeah.
You realize why.
Yeah, sometimes failure is the best teacher. One of the things, so I just finished teaching an intro class on ethics, and one of the things that I had the students do is every week we would study a theory. Let's say that we're studying hedonism or natural law or consequentialism, and then I would assign a literary piece that then just has some of the motifs that the students need to would be oh, this is how it would look like. This is how this thing that we read about in consequentialism that then translates to this situation in real life. And that sort of gives them something to look forward to. This is applicable. This is this is a situation that you could end up in, somebody else could end up in. And this is where all the knowledge that we're teaching them is not devoid. One of the things that I remember asking myself is what am I going to do with all that math that I was studying, like growing up. Like I can tell you now that I have not used any differential equations since, like, I don't know, for 10 years now or something like that. But how do we show the value in what we're teaching students? And I think a lot of the emphasis in the educational circles is that there's always something that you need to always show them that it has something to do with their lives. And if we're trying to teach them some moral abstracts, then we also need to connect that as well.
I think what's interesting about research and data has an issue, has its own bias. So like personality disorders is one of the things that I think about most when I think about the difference between the argument of STEM and STEAM.
Yeah.
How much does the arts promote narcissism in certain contexts, but in others it's not. In others it might actually promote the opposite, like the cure, so-called cure to narcissism in some people. So it's finding out why things individually don't work before we can just like put a research paper up that says, well, this is the result, because the results are not what participants fear. There's more to it, implicit to it.
Yeah. So sometimes something will work in a certain way for this student and work another way for this student. And I think this is where the differences between, like, what policy do we implement and what are the things that we need to look for as teachers, like individually, like one-on-one? What are the trends that you're noticing as you keep going through the semester in your students? What kind of examples are they giving you? Are they giving you more examples that show that they're more empathetic, or that shows that they're like sort of there's some resistance? Maybe you're getting an excellent return from, like, I don't know, like 80% of the class, but there's 20% that you need to, like, sort of find a different strategy to, like, get to them. And that will always be there. And with standardization, what you're looking for is, can I get as much of what I need, what I'm aiming for as possible? But as much as possible, there's always going to have failures at some level with some people, regardless of the reasons. But that's always going to be there. And this is why, like, the personal touch, like, just being there. So this is something that you cannot automate. Like, you can't, like, I don't know, like, there's no robot that's just going to be like, oh, I can teach you about this. No, there's got to be some more personal touch that is involved.
I was going to bounce off the idea of learning from failure, and maybe it's meant to be failure, but I know even for myself, I learned the best just from, like, experience, real life, like, experience or immersion into something, some type of topic. So what could that look like? Like, for example, I'm dwelling on the example you gave of the workshop, and with the refugee and immigrant folks. I'm wondering what level of exposure do those students have in real life to refugees? And it's one thing to do a workshop or to, learn something from a distance, but if that's like one time, I doubt that's ever going to go very far. It's very different to actually have like some level of real life application with what you're learning. Like, I know even I'm 30 years old and I have rediscovered math. And it's so funny to me, but I truly, like, I in my free time will nerd out on, I'll listen to these podcasts with these mathematicians / philosophers.
That's awesome.
That, are really actually breaking down what is the significance of these numbers, right? Like,
Exactly.
Right? Like, what do they represent philosophically? And I almost feel robbed in my elementary school experience with the way they didn't have any sense of wonder.
Yes.
In these topics.
To add on to that, I think that's one of the biggest problems we have in school when it comes to STEM, is we're trying to just shove this information
Yeah.
in our kids' brains
Yeah.
without telling them why are they learning it.
Yeah.
And I had a friend of mine whose daughter was going through fractions, but her
Yeah.
daughter was really struggling with fractions. All I had to say was, teach her to bake.
Yeah.
You bake cookies, you're going to learn fractions.
You bake cookies and then you learn
bake
fractions.
a cake, you're going to learn fractions.
It's something, it shows you that this is how,
Exactly. Hey, we need to make 2 dozen cookies. The recipe calls for a dozen. Multiply everything by 2. And they're going to learn fractions.
trying to give it sense.
Yeah,
to,
give it
yeah.
meaning to the reality. That
Yeah. So something like sense making, or something also that's called like participatory sense making, like just figuring out things out as a group, like all of us like trying to look at like a problem and just like grappling with it and like bouncing ideas with one another, and sort of like at the same time that you're trying to teach an analytic sort of skill, you're also trying to teach communication. You're also trying to teach like negotiation. All of that stuff. And to your point about like just having something that is in the real world, one of my colleagues was giving had a class last semester that was half of it was taught in on campus and the other half was taught in a prison. And half of the students were inmates and half of them were students. And the point of the class was to sort of bring both perspectives to the table and actually have those conversations. Like, what did you learn? How do we sort of like get in a better place as we transition from one environment to the next? And that was a very interesting experience for everyone involved to just get these perspectives on the table. And that's where things like, as you said, like, what do you know about refugees? Like, well, you actually need to go and talk to some. You need to sit down with people and talk to them.
So, like, for refugees in England, like right now there are riots going on.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yep.
a crime occurred, and the alleged perpetrator was a minor, and no details were released, and so this information was
Yeah.
coming out that it was a refugee that had been the perpetrator. So, like, in that context, like, certainly, perspective taking and empathy are important, but to what extent are we also emphasizing how important, media literacy would be in this kind of scenario?
Absolutely. And this is something that you can look at it from Truth's perspective. You can look at it from the perspective of like where is it originating from, and you can look at holding these media outlets accountable for the things that they say and the information that they put out. Especially that like many times for many documented cases, an outlet would put out a story that would get debunked, but all they do is just take down the story and then but the damage is done. Like the people who read the story are already like, oh yeah, we know exactly what happened. But then nobody reads the debunking article. Nobody reads, oh, this is actually not true. So you can look at it from that perspective, but you can also look at it from the perspective of like the receiver. So there is responsibility from people who disseminate certain types of information, but there's also responsibility from people who are receiving it. Are you applying good filters? Are you just receiving information from the people that you trust and that's it, and you're not trying to like question things? I think that has something to do with like what kind of environment are you surrounding yourself in? Because a lot of it has to do with fear. A lot of it has to do with like, I'm so afraid I'm just gonna cocoon in my group, cocoon within my people who just share the same ideas as I do. But a lot of this doesn't change overnight, and a lot of it is not going to change with just violence meets violence. The reason why we reached this situation is because I think there's a lot of conversations that were not had at earlier stages that led us to that situation. And if we're trying to change that situation, there are certain steps that we can take right now, but long-term thinking has to be involved if we're trying to change these perspectives. And that's where things like perspective taking, communication skills come to play a certain role. If you're trying to teach people, you need to try to teach them to be citizens, not just workers, I think.
That'd be an interesting research is moral development in relation to emotional intelligence.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm sure there is people who looked into this. I haven't looked myself, but that would be an interesting thing to look into. Yeah, emotional intelligence and moral development there might be some research that would indicate a relation, but I'm not aware of it.
I think when it comes to the literacy of media, you used the word responsibility.
Yeah.
I don't think it's responsibility. I think it's not their responsibility. It was their parents' responsibility, their
Yeah.
teachers' responsibility to teach why you have these literacy skills and why you question issues and critical thinking and analysis.
Yeah.
But it really comes down to skill and reinforcement.
I agree that there's a large part of it that comes down to like who taught the people who hold these opinions this way. But I would also say that part of it is still the responsibility, because the interesting part is that the rhetoric, when it's disseminated, it's not just that it's being packaged as like this, here is what you need to believe, but there is some sort of like an argument that's being made that sort of like shows you that this is legitimate. And if the skills that are involved in the argument making, you're already able to follow this, then I expect you to be able to follow this to sort of like ask question, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, if you're able to follow that logic. But why are you not doing that? Why is the argument being distilled to like one sentence that refugees are bad, we need to kick them out, and not that the argument is like, okay, there is like a multiple premises, can I look at them as much and like sort of like ask if they should be believed as much as I believe in the final product. And this is where the responsibility still falls on the person, because you are responsible for the argument that you're saying is really good, and you're trying to associate, like, just pick up as the thing that you believe in. So as much as I have sympathy for some of the people who reached that situation because of the environment that they were in, the parents that taught them this way or that way, I still have to ask questions about the individuals. Like, you are able to sort of critically assess on some level, where is that when it comes to these issues? Especially that this is like something that that touches a lot of people's lives. There's still responsibility from you as a person to sort of apply those skills if you say that you know, this issue is so important to you. All right, and that's all the time we have. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and thank you for coming out.
Thank you. Those were fascinating studies that I'm going to take back to my advocacy spaces. Okay, so thank you all for coming. Science on Tap, we do the science education once a month on the first Wednesday of the month. Next month is on September 4th. We are going to learn about the WOW cart. The Environmental Protection Agency has developed the Water on Wheels cart in response to some natural disasters that happened years ago. They saw a need to be able to treat water on site in impacted locations where the infrastructure has been destroyed. So they're going to come and talk about that research and what they've developed and what they're going to be doing forward to support areas, because we all know natural disasters are increasing and getting larger in scope. So hopefully it'll be an uplifting conversation despite the natural disasters conversation part of it. So join us next month on September 4th. Again, thank you to our partners Radio Artifact and Urban Artifact, and to our sponsorship with UC Center for Public Engagement with Science. And I hope to see you all next month. Thanks.